Welcome to Marketing Demystified, the podcast that connects the dots for business leaders to drive revenue through effective marketing strategy. We chat with marketing experts on different topics that will help you ramp up your revenue. We stream live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can listen to us on your favorite podcast platforms. Marketing Demystified, the podcast, is presented to you by GrowGetter, your partner in growth marketing. And here's today's episode.
Hello, everyone. Are you ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered with practical tips to boost your marketing efforts? You're in the right place. Welcome to Marketing Demystified. I'm your host, Jenn Mancusi, CEO and co-founder of GrowGetter, your growth marketing partner. Now, I want you to think for a moment about the last time you abandoned a form online because maybe it asked for too much information, or you tried to tap a button in a marketing email and it just wouldn't cooperate. Small moments like this create friction, and over time, they cost businesses leads, customers, and revenue. The problem is friction points aren't always obvious. They can hide anywhere in the customer experience, making it harder for people to buy, engage, and come back. My guest today, Sonia Thompson, is a growth strategist, founder of Frictionless Growth Lab, and host of the Frictionless Growth Marketing podcast. Today, Sonia is here to break down where friction usually hides and what it's costing brands, even if they don't realize it, and how you can start removing it without a full overhaul. Welcome to the show, Sonia.
Thanks so much for having me, Jen.
Thank you so much for being here. I just can see it now. I'm going to trip over this word frictionless the whole episode, so bear with me. But I'm really excited to talk about this with you because I think it's often an overlooked part of the experience that can really have a big impact.
It absolutely does. And if I think about just my experiences as a consumer, I think there's a lot of times, if we're probably honest, we are frustrated a lot as consumers. And whenever we have a choice, that probably means we don't go back. So my goal is to help as many brands as possible not send those frustrating experiences to their consumers so they can grow.
Yeah, it's so true. And we do have a lot of choices. So especially when we're moving quickly, when something doesn't work, I have to want it really bad to try it another way or to go back again. So it's important to get it right.
Definitely.
So let's start with just the foundation of what customer friction actually is. Is this like a user experience issue? Is it bigger than that? Where does it kind of sit and show up the most often?
So it often appears from a user experience standpoint, and I think that's probably where most people's minds initially go whenever they're thinking about friction. But ultimately, it touches every part of the customer journey, every part of the marketing mix. And I would say for most brands, friction shows up before you ever reach the customer because it comes and it starts to creep in those foundational stages of your marketing. So I feel like every consumer, whether they're consciously or subconsciously, is asking the question, is this product, is this ad, is this communication, whatever it is that the brand is presenting, is this experience for someone like me? And someone like me could be any form of identity. It could be someone who is not tech friendly, someone who is over 50, someone who is neurodivergent, someone who has kids or doesn't have kids, someone who's plus size, someone who's Black, someone who's part of the Asian community. There are so many different identities that exist, but most consumers are trying to figure out, is this for me? Is this for someone like me or not? And ultimately, whenever they're interacting with something a brand puts forth, friction often lends itself whenever people don't get an answer to that question pretty quickly. And that can show up in forms, that can show up on landing pages, it can show up on imagery that a brand puts forth, it could show up on their social media. Any particular touch point that a consumer might have with a brand is communicating whether the brand intends it or not, whether or not that is for a specific type of person. And that's a lot of times where that friction comes in that brands probably aren't thinking about. And there are other instances, like, let's say your page is loading slow, or somebody gets a 404 error on their page, or a form doesn't quite go where they think it's going to go. Those are other forms of friction that are important as well. But ultimately, friction is any type of barrier that prevents or slows or causes your consumer or your ideal customer to pause. Anything that interrupts the natural flow of them taking the next step forward with you.
That's so interesting that it really isn't even about them taking the steps, but the like sort of what they're witnessing as well as part of the experience is friction. And I like how you described it of like, is it for someone like me? And even if we're not asking that question out loud, that it is something that we're asking ourselves as we're just navigating the world. Is this for me or not? I had a mentor who was from Google, and years ago she told me the story of when they first launched YouTube, and the team that was building the YouTube app, whatever, they didn't have anyone on the team who was left-handed.
Yeah.
And so when they launched YouTube, all of the left-handed people who were recording videos with their left hand, all of their videos were upside down. And it's such a something nobody thought about, right? In terms of inclusivity, or is this for me, right? And how things were being built. And it wasn't necessarily about, something was broken in the customer experience, because the journey and the steps were the same. But the outcome told that story of, oh, this isn't for you. This is built for a different group of people ultimately, and built by a different group of people.
Yeah, well. I resonate with this completely because I am left-handed. I am left-handed. And just even something as simple as growing up with scissors that were not designed for left-handed people. So I always avoided cutting because whenever I could, because anything that I cut looked a complete and total mess, because at that time the scissors weren't made for left-handed people. And so that is a wonderful example of how these little things of identity turn into much bigger issues for people that just cause them to be frustrated and be like, yeah, this isn't it. And they just stop, or they go someplace else. And in the vast majority of those cases, none of it is intentional. It's just, something that you didn't think about because it's probably not something that's part of your day-to-day experience or a challenge that you're going to think of. So, and that's kind of where that friction comes up. It's just something that wasn't top of mind.
Right, for sure. And so sort of categorizing these different friction points, obviously there is the user experience side of things. And then some of the things you're talking about, like, is it brand, positioning, accessibility? Are there any other kind of categories of friction points that teams like aren't really looking for? Or is that
sometimes those kind of cover the main ones. Other times it comes from different types of e-commerce types of situations, or a lot of times I think, for instance, maybe you're not buying something, but I remember I spent some time living in Argentina, and ultimately there were things that I used to do in the US online that I quickly discovered that I couldn't do while I was in Argentina, because there were permissions, maybe there were videos that I couldn't watch, or access to certain websites that I couldn't get to because there were some things that were just blocked. That caused a lot of friction. Now I had to spend some time getting a VPN and doing all this other kind of stuff to figure out how I could get access. But it was something that never crossed my mind until I was in that situation. And we find that it just exists in every single part of the customer journey. And you probably won't know where it shows up until someone with a particular identity might let you know, yeah, this is a real issue. So for instance, a couple of years ago did some user testing interviews with people with different identities. And I did one with a woman who is hearing impaired. And we went through and we were looking at some podcasts, and she was going through and she was expressing how there were accessibility issues with the vast majority of podcasts because it wasn't easy for her to access the transcript for the episode. It might have taken, for the ones who did have it, best case scenario, maybe it would have been 8 clicks for her to get there, as in comparison to someone who wasn't hearing impaired, they were able to get to the content that they needed much more quickly. She also talked about brands and websites that had all caps on their social media videos or on YouTube videos or titles, as well as even their websites. So sometimes it dabbles in accessibility. Sometimes it's just plain old in their marketing content that they're putting forth. It appears everywhere if you aren't intentional about making sure that you're designing for a frictionless experience. And the only way to deliver these experiences that don't have friction in them is to know who you're designing for.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess with that in mind, like knowing who you're designing for, who your ideal customer is, and really thinking probably beyond your team of people that are building whatever you're building, whether it be marketing or a product. How do you identify the friction that maybe you're not necessarily looking for? Because we've talked on this show about customer journey before and about mapping the user experience and looking for friction points there. And maybe some of the easier things to identify are like the forms with too many fields.
Mm-hmm.
That's maybe what everybody's looking for. But how would you identify those areas that are blind spots for you as an individual or as a team that are causing friction with your customers?
So hopefully this will be good news to most people, because I can hear people saying, well, Sonia, I mean, friction can exist everywhere. There's so many different identities. And that's why I keep going back to, it's important to really have a solid understanding of who the identities are that you want to reach. Now, most every brand and brand leader will have buyer personas, ideal customer avatars, whatever the name is that you call them for your brand. Most brands have those. But my experience is that many of those are often incomplete because they don't take into account identity at any, and aside from some of those basic demographics. So my encouragement for the brands that I work with, some of my clients, is that you focus your buyer personas on making sure that you understand who are the different types of identities that are included in these different categories of people or your segmentation that you've identified. So does this person that you've identified include people who live in Canada? Does it include men and women? Does it include people who are married, people who are retired? Make a list of those different identities. I like to call those identities mosaics. So if you think of your total addressable market like a mosaic rather than a melting pot, you'll see that there are many people in different groups of people who exist. And then you figure out which are the ones that you want to make sure feel seen and supported and like they belong with your brand. Who is it that you, at this point in time, have the resources to be able to make sure that you're taking this journey that is removing as much friction as possible? Once you've identified what those identities are, what those mosaics are, then you can understand how they'll go through the different journey that you're mapping for them and deliver one that is as frictionless as possible. So I worked with a client recently that wanted to target Spanish speakers. So they were spending a lot of money on translating all of their promotional materials into Spanish. They had photography that was more reflective of the Spanish-speaking population here in the US. They were running Spanish-speaking ads. They had designed a landing page. But whenever I went through and did the audit for them to see how it was resonating, and I went and I talked to specifically Spanish-speaking consumers, we found that in the customer experience, even though they had decided that they wanted to reach this group, there was a part in the customer journey that was breaking down because everything wasn't available in language. So they had Spanish language ads running in Spanish language channels. They got to a Spanish language landing page, but the links that people needed to click through to go to take the next step forward led to English speaking sites or English speaking phone numbers. So they had done all this work, right? But they came to a point to where the experience suddenly had a lot of friction in it for Spanish speakers because it was defaulting to a system that they had already had and they hadn't quite fully had the chance to develop. And so what the recommendation is whenever you are identifying which communities you want to reach, take the time to map through that full journey. And again, it doesn't mean that you have to have everything perfect right away. They were still converting Spanish speaking consumers, but not at the rates that they could have been had the whole journey been as well thought out and planned as they would have liked at the time in which they started running everything. So it takes time, but it starts with really making sure that you know who it is that you want to reach, and then figuring out what's the journey that they take with you, being very specific about where that journey might be different than it is for other people, and then making sure that any barriers or friction points that exist in that journey are removed to the best of your ability to make the process as smooth as possible for them.
Yeah, for sure. I love how you described the mosaic, because I think understanding the differences, even within segments, the different people that might exist, where, historically, it's very easy to say, like, moms with kids between the ages of X and Y, but there's so many. Are you married? Are you
Yeah.
divorced? Are you a single mom? Are you, a married couple of two moms? Like, all those people are going to feel different, have a different identity, right?
Right.
Even if they fit into that demographic, or even as you're talking about Spanish speakers, well, are they, do they speak multiple languages, or is Spanish their first language? Are they Spanish speaking, people who had English as a first language? Like, everybody's going to have a slightly different preference and experience within that one group. And so that concept of mosaic as opposed to melting pot and not treating everyone the same within those different segments is really important. I'm wondering what your thoughts are. I want to talk about like removing those friction moments and things like that, but I'm curious your thoughts about, for marketing specifically, our ability to like really hyper personalize experiences via marketing, and the risk, I guess, of getting that wrong, right? Because there's technology out there right now that will allow us to give you a very individual experience as opposed to grouping people into these larger segments. But I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts on that in general? And is there a way to approach it that you recommend that doesn't create new friction by getting it wrong?
So I feel like marketers are very good at personalization, but the gap that we run into often is whenever identity enters the picture, because as a society, specifically in the US, and I think in other cultures, it might come a little easier. We have a harder time talking directly about identity and people's differences. It's uncomfortable for a lot of people. And because it's uncomfortable, it makes it harder to have meaningful conversations about people's differences and what they need to be successful. And as a result, I think that we have to figure out a way to overcome that hurdle. The example that I use here, we were in the pet store. My husband is normally the one who buys the dog food for our dog. But one time he was at work and we needed to get some dog food. So I needed to go in there. And when I tell you the amount of varieties of dog food there is, there are so, I think I went on the website later for the brand, and they said there was 80 something different variations of dog food based upon the needs. Do you need a weight control? Is it for big dogs, puppies, older dogs? There's so many different ones, but they are able to have that degree of personalization because they have a degree of intimacy with dogs and dog owners and those different people, so that they are comfortable enough talking about those differences. We need to be comfortable talking about differences like race, gender, perhaps sexual orientation, neurodivergence, disability, etc., so that we can get to a point to where we can have honest conversations with consumers about what their differences are and how those differences may show up in their customer journey or in their decision-making process, so that we can start to make different types of decisions. And that really boils down to customer intimacy. At the end of the day, it becomes easier to identify what friction exists whenever you can talk to someone about what's different about their journey, and how their identity might make what it is that you're producing, where they might need some level of, I don't want to say adjustment, but they might need something different from someone who might be quote unquote part of the masses. So it really boils down to getting comfortable thinking about identity, and then at the same time, developing a deep degree of intimacy with that community. And once you have that degree of intimacy, and even as you start developing relationships with them, people's expectation isn't that you'll be perfect, especially as you're getting started. But if you're building relationship with them and they see that you're trying, they're very much willing to show you what it is that you need to know. Hey, this is working. Oh, wait, this can work a little bit better, and going along the process and co-creating with them.
Yeah, for sure. I absolutely love the analogy with the pet food, because despite there being 84 different varieties, you know exactly what you need because they call it out. And
Yeah,
I have no problem. It's never even crossed my mind that I'm buying like food for overweight senior dog.
right,
At no point has that been like offensive to me or
right,
sensitive. Like, my dog's overweight and he's old, so I get him the overweight senior dog food, right?
right.
For humans, we're not calling those identities out. We're not making it so obvious that this is going to help solve your problem, right? Not that it's just because you fit into some demographic group, and so we're going to, target you on, on Facebook or whatever
Right,
versus somewhere
right.
else, but actually saying we understand your challenge and we have a solution for it. You're right. It is not something we talk about as openly, and certainly don't advertise as directly as we do with
Yeah,
pets, for
right.
example, or
And
maybe.
I want to add that sometimes the solution isn't a great deal of personalization.
Right.
Sometimes it's just a pure acknowledgement that we see you and you exist. So I did a study of brand websites, and I did an audit of them. And I found that in 90% of the websites, it people who were 50 or older were not visibly present in the imagery. So imagine in this age group, these findings were actually validated by another study that was done by the CME Index, where they found that people who were 50 and older, in particular, were where previous years they had shown up in beauty products specifically, there were less and less visible. And these are the people that have the buying power right now, right? And so what was happening is, in 90% of the websites that I was reviewing, and we're seeing this happen across the board, people are going to them and they're not seeing themselves. They feel invisible, they feel erased. And even though the product might be exactly what they want, to go and not see yourself is enough of a friction point for people to just say, yeah, this isn't for someone like me. And that's it, right? And the
Sure.
minute someone does put a photo of someone like them in the marketing, it could be an inferior product, right? But the minute someone does that, they're like, oh, this is for me, and off we go.
Yeah. Yeah, we see it on the reverse side too, with kids and representation on television or in shows, or,
Yeah.
people like for the very first time seeing, you know, uh, Black Little Mermaid, and
Yeah.
there was like video reactions of little girls
Yeah.
seeing that for the first, and how powerful that is in, not only representation, but also in buying power and people
Right.
wanting to buy those products. And I do think that the aging population is getting the short end a lot of the times, because there's a lot of friction for them to get what they need. I had this experience with my grandfather during COVID when he needed to be the first in line for the vaccines when they were coming out, but everything had to be done online. And we're talking about a man who has never touched a computer, does not have an email address, barely has a phone, So the only way for him to do the thing that needed to be done specifically for his age group was to come and sit next to me, and I set it all up for him, because
it was very friction-filled process, right?
Very friction-filled. It was not built to suit the age group that it was meant to be serving. The exact ideal customer profile wasn't being, there was no in-person option or phone call option for them. And that was a very friction-filled experience for sure. And we made it work individually, but not everybody has that ability. And so, anyways, yes, lots to learn from, lots of examples of friction. So how do we reduce friction? How can, once we've identified what it is in our own brand or our own customer or user experience, what does fixing it actually look like? Is it that full overhaul, or are there little things we can do to start to remove those bits of friction along the way?
So I think that once you have identified who the different pieces of what the different pieces of your mosaic are, of your total addressable market, then it becomes easier to think about how you can design experiences or improve what you already have. And whenever you're designing something moving forward, how can you make it better? So the way I like to have people think about this is, imagine you are preparing for a dinner party, and you are going to have a gluten-free person, you're going to have someone who can't eat dairy, someone who is a vegetarian, right? And someone who is doing intermittent fasting, right? You've got all these different things. How would you design your experiences with this knowledge in mind? You would approach your dinner party menu and even the time that you would set it in a completely different manner than if you didn't know about these restrictions that existed for different people, or these different preferences that or needs that these different people had. So first is just having that awareness, and then being intentional about designing what you're doing so that it can work for as many people as possible and be as frictionless as possible. Knowing that everything might not be exactly the way you want it or as perfect in the beginning as you go, but that awareness and then going through it helps you figure it out. So that's the design part. A second way also is helpful to go back and look at your current experience, because sometimes the fastest way to growth or to realizing the benefits is kind of just fixing what you've already got. And it's just a matter of going back and evaluating. So whether that's through user testing, whether that's through your bringing someone else in to do an audit, whether that's in you kind of putting on your hat through the lens of different people with different identities to evaluate what works for them and what doesn't. I did an interview with a woman. She was Muslim, and she was talking about how frustrating it was for her to go to in-person events because she doesn't drink, and she doesn't even go to events that are designed around drinking. And in that process, she found that so many in-person business events are designed around alcohol. So we started to think about this and realize that it's not just her decision around alcohol is a faith-based one, but there are plenty other people who don't drink for plenty of other reasons, whether, they're trying very hard to be sober, personal preference, whatever the reason. But if you are a brand that is putting on an event and you are aware that you've got a mosaic of people who don't drink alcohol, the way that you might go about planning for that, or you might look at what you've already prepared and say that, ooh, we don't have something that really supports this group of people. How can we make adjustments so that they do feel included, or this isn't going to be a barrier for them to participate? So once you have that in your mind, you can then look at what you've already have with a new lens. And then you have a good foundation for how to create things moving forward.
Now, thinking about both of those examples, the dinner party example, the, business cocktail hour or, mixology class that we've all been to at some point, I'm sure. We're not saying you have to accommodate everyone in the same way, right? Like, so everyone at your dinner party doesn't have to now eat gluten-free, vegan, and dairy-free or whatever, but that there's optionality and
yes,
something that could fit everyone, right?
Right. So let's use the dinner party example. And I am someone who's gluten-free, right? So I have lived this very much. It doesn't, you wouldn't want to have someone like me show up and the only thing for them to eat is the salad, right? Because that doesn't feel like they have fully been able to participate in the dinner party. Again, like you mentioned, everything on the menu doesn't have to be gluten-free, but is there something specifically like an entree or a part that makes them feel not not othered, or not like an afterthought or a burden, but like, hey, we intentionally put this here for you. It works for everybody. Or I mean, it works for you specifically, or it works for everybody and no one feels like they're being deprived in any sort of way. Those are the types of things that can work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not gluten-free, but I do have gluten-free friends, so I know this very well. But I am alcohol-free, and so I relate to that story where, I don't have a problem going, but there have absolutely been business events that are most of them are designed around alcohol.
Yeah.
And so you can tell the difference between one that has like a little fancy mocktail option or one that at least serves food. That's always nice.
Right. Let me just bring your attention to one other thing. I went to a conference late last year that had like 10,000 people, right? And they had food all over the place and they had snack breaks. I was over the moon where one day they offered a tater tot snack break, and the tater tots, they specifically were marked as gluten-free. And so I wasn't able to participate in all of the snack breaks, but I was delighted by this one snack break that I could participate in because they are aware we've got some gluten-free people and, maybe not all, but some of the stuff, and it can make a big difference, right? And so it's not always that it needs to be everything, but just acknowledge that these people are there. And because they're so used to, from specific identities, there are a lot of people who are so used to being ignored or just have to make it work. Whenever you do, sometimes even, they receive a little bit of nugget or a shout out that makes them feel seen. You would be so surprised in how happy it'll make them feel, but also the loyalty that they feel towards you because you took the time to see them when most people don't.
For sure. It is a nice feeling, right? To feel like, I'm not other here. I'm not different. There's something here for me too.
Yeah.
Now, I want to hear maybe some examples, if you have them, of some transformations that you've seen. What's the payoff to all this, where you invest this time and effort into the design and understanding our mosaic and building that frictionless or as close to it as possible experience. What changes for the brand? What changes for the relationship with their customers and ultimately their growth if they're committing to creating that frictionless customer experience?
I would say the biggest thing that you will start to see once you get this right is your customer acquisition costs will start to lower. Your conversion rates will increase, because what's going to happen, it's kind of like you're closing a leaky bucket. Like if you're having a bunch of people come to a landing page, your website, your social media, and they're getting there and they're realizing, they're asking this question, is this for someone like me? And they don't get an answer, which a lot of times not getting an answer is the same as no, or they see signals and I'm like, oh yeah, this isn't for me, then they're going to keep moving forward to something else that's not you. But if they come to what you've created and designed with them in mind, to make sure that you're answering that question, yes, this is for someone like you, you're going to start to see people not hesitate, not kind of go someplace else. They're going to move forward. So you're going to start to see higher conversions. Your cost to acquire them will become lower because less people are going to kind of I guess opt out by self-selection that this isn't for me. And overall, your marketing will become much more effective. You're not going to be paying to bring someone into the process only for them to exit out whenever they hit this particular degree of friction. And so that's what I want to make sure that we're encouraging people and leaving them with today. There's a lot of opportunity for growth for doing this because you're going to start converting more people. At the same time, there's a lot of opportunity for you to stop losing people that you're already losing that you probably don't know that you're losing for reasons about this friction. So it's kind of like a double whammy that will work in your favor. You will stop losing the people you were losing previously, and more people will come to you and realize yes, and they'll move forward.
Yeah, it's really exponential at that point.
Yeah.
What do you recommend as companies are kind of cleaning up those friction points and see their conversion rates improving? How do you go back to the people that you've lost and say, I know you didn't think this was for you, but it is now? Is there a win back strategy once you started to get this right?
There is. I think it's helpful to bring people along on the journey that and let them know what you're working on and what's new and what's different and why they should give you another look. Right? If before they answered, they were asking, is this for someone like me? And they didn't find an answer. Now you can say, hey, this is for someone like you, right? So I mentioned I'm gluten-free. And there are a lot of times where we would like to go to different restaurants, but we can't find the information that we need. If I suddenly there was a brand that I did not consider, or I considered them, but I realized, they don't really have any options. But then they suddenly started promoting, hey, we've got this gluten-free thing. We're absolutely going to come and try it, right? Like we're absolutely going to reconsider because now we know you've designed it with me in mind. So I think going back to the conversation that we had previously about sometimes we get a little nervous about talking about people's identity. We have to talk about identity so that we can specifically let people know this is for you. And that's where and getting more comfortable moving from melting pot into mosaic becomes so important. If you can speak to individual mosaics within your marketing to let them know about the things that you've designed for them and that you are for them, they will know, right? They don't have to answer the question because you've already sort of put it together for them and connected the dots.
For sure. For sure. I'm thinking about an old project that I worked on where we were trying to identify friction points really specifically on a website, right? Where the conversion rate was a little lower than we wanted it to be. And so we put in an exit survey on the site itself. So anytime anyone was leaving the site, it was, hey, before you go, just one quick question to figure out like what did you come here looking for, and were you able to find it? And allowing people to, not everybody is going to take the survey. They're already leaving your website, right? They're ready to go. But the responses that we got were so valuable and it's connecting for me with what you're talking about, letting them tell us what their identity was, what they were trying to achieve, whether or not they got the information. And so they're like, I don't need anymore. Now I'm going to go. Or if they couldn't find it, if it wasn't in a language that was, that they could understand, not in terms of actual language, but just in terms of what the positioning more so than anything else. And so I think what you were saying about like bringing people along the journey with you about what you're changing and what you're working on, but also looking for opportunities to ask questions. What are you looking for? How are you identifying? And what is it that you aren't seeing here? In the example of food, I'm looking for gluten-free options. Right. Great. Now I know that about you because I asked, and I'm not trying to guess. And that feels very collaborative, and that feels like when I think about long-term brand loyalty,
Right.
that's what I'm, as a consumer, am looking for, is a company that is investing in me and curious and wants to deliver, regardless of what my needs are.
Right. They're listening, right? They're listening to you and actually acting on what it is that you've told them. That makes a big difference. One other thing, because you brought up research, that this is an objection that I hear often was, hey, well, we tested these messages and it didn't come out in the research that these messages didn't work. Like, people across the board of different identities were included in our research, and we never got any inkling that these messages weren't resonating. And the response that I would have, and this is backed by data that we've seen this, is just because if you're not asking identity specific questions of people, they are probably not going to give you an identity specific response, even though that may play a role in their decision-making process. One, because it might not register for them in that moment. Like, this is the reason why they've made the decision, because subconsciously they're making it automatically. But at other points, unless you're asking them specifically how identity might play, it might not be something that gets offered up from the consumer perspective, which means that you aren't having a full picture of what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like research design is so important when you're testing anything, and like making sure you're including those right kind of bits of data that are going to factor in. There's also a lot of opportunity, especially with message testing, to be like, hey, what do you think? That's a horrible question to ask in a survey, because everyone's going to say, yeah, looks great. It's going to over-index positive, where, if you ask more about experiences and, versus what someone would do. I think hypothetical questions in research can be really challenging. So if you're saying, hey, if you saw this ad, would you click on it? People will probably say yes. But if you ask them, tell me about the last time you clicked on an ad, what was it for? What drew you to it? You're going to get a much different answer, and something maybe it's a little harder to synthesize and come up with your messaging based on that line of questioning, but it's going to be so much more accurate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us today, Sonia. This was such a good conversation. It was far more than what I thought we were getting out of talking about friction in the customer experience. I so appreciate that. So thank you for walking us through what that means for you and for sharing your expertise.
Totally my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Everyone, please make sure you're following Sonia on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to Marketing Demystified wherever you get your podcasts. Join us next time for more conversations that help